Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Hello, welcome. Now you have to stop talking, because we have to begin. Welcome, everyone, to the Medieval Institute on a very cold, wintry night here in November. We're glad you decided to join us. My name is Tom Berman. I'm the director of the Medieval Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to one of the great events we do every year, usually about this time in the fall semester, which is that we encourage our graduate students to collectively decide upon a scholar to invite to campus and turn the keys over to them. And they do all of the inviting, they do all of the arranging of the event, and this is this year's iteration of the graduate student lecture series. To introduce our lecturer today, I'd like to bring forward one of our fine graduate students, Bruce McCuskey. Bruce.
Hello, good evening, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out, again, as Dr. Berman said, on this snowy evening. So just a bit of a preface, if you ask a student in the MI what makes the MI distinctive, it's supposed to be allegedly our interdisciplinarity, right? That we blend sort of different disciplines and sort of make them a greater whole. Oftentimes, however, that's just kind of a pious hope, and we quickly silo ourselves into little disciplines. But it's very nice to have here with us a scholar who really does do genuinely interdisciplinary work and work that very few people do. So Dr. Hanna Gentili, after her BA and MA in Italy, she completed her PhD at the Warburg under Charles Burnett, and she undertook a very fascinating research project on the 15th century Jewish philosopher and Kabbalist Yohanan Alamano, investigating the Aristotelian psychology that formed the background to his Kabbalistic and mystical speculations. Along the way, in so doing, she worked cataloging Hebrew manuscripts at the British Library and participated in a really very important and groundbreaking digital humanities project called the Illinote Project, which digitized and cataloged just an astonishing array of diagrams of Kabbalistic imitative schemes ranging across time and space, and which has just made everyone's research in that field immensely easier and more productive. Currently, she is undertaking or leading as a research associate at Hamburg a project which is entitled Hebrew Philosophical Manuscripts as Sites of Engagement as part of the Institute for Jewish Philosophy and Religion. And she examines the role of Hebrew manuscripts in the transition of both Jewish philosophy but also Arabic philosophy from manuscript to early print culture in the Middle Ages. And so, as I said, we said at the beginning, this is a project that is not only giving you just a heavy and wonderful dose of philosophy, but that brings in the history of the book, art history, manuscript studies, and especially, as we'll see tonight, also philology, into just this very illuminating and groundbreaking whole. And so let's welcome her to begin.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me here at the Medieval Institute. I'm honored to have received this invitation from the graduate students, and I would like to thank the director, Professor Berman, the organizers, and in particular Bruce McCuskey for the excellent planning of these days here in Notre Dame. It's really a pleasure to be here. This presentation is based on my current research on the transmission of natural philosophy in Jewish late medieval thought and its impact in the 15th and 16th century Renaissance context. I'm currently working within the HAPMASI ERC project, which is led by Dr. Yoav Meirav at the University of Hamburg, which is a project dedicated to Hebrew philosophical manuscripts. And my research has benefited immensely from daily exchanges with colleagues at the Institute for Jewish Religion and Philosophy in Hamburg. Personally, I've always been interested in the teaching and learning of philosophy in Renaissance Italy, where the encounter between the Greco-Arabic Hebrew tradition on the one hand and the Latin scholastic and humanist sources on the other gave rise to a renewed corpus of philosophical works. My talk today concerns precisely the idea of a corpus and of a text. What are the factors that determine the formation and stabilization of a certain text that then becomes part of those reference editions that have shaped our way of learning philosophy for centuries? Today, through examples that concern the exchanges between the Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin traditions, we'll talk about the delicate balance between the aspiration to reach completeness and reconstruct a text or a corpus that are often ideal, and the reality of the textual transmission of sources as it happened through time. What will emerge is a world of intellectual figures, philosophical activity, scribes, and manuscript cultures that has not made its way into the standard corpus and that sheds light on centuries of interpretation of philosophical works which are not represented outside of the manuscript world. Looking at this world is fundamental to understand how philosophy was really studied and how far both modern and early modern editions are sometimes from the reality of the transmission of a text. Through an approach that is inclusive of the manuscript tradition, we not only gain a better understanding of the Hebrew and Latin history of philosophy, but also of the Arabic one. In fact, as we will see, Hebrew manuscripts bear witness to a number of texts and intellectual figures that otherwise would be completely unknown to us. I will start with an introduction on the early printed editions of Aristotle and Averroes, where Hebrew-Latin exchanges played a fundamental role. This will allow us to understand the context in which these editions were produced and the importance of the relationship between printed and manuscript transmission. I will then present you 3 case studies from the Hebrew manuscript transmission of natural philosophy that contribute to our understanding of the richness and complexity of the pre-modern period and will allow us to discuss the long-lasting consequences of certain editorial practices. In the middle of the 16th century, in Venice, we see the publication of the Junta edition of Aristotle's works, accompanied by Averroes' commentaries. This edition was an astonishing editorial project aimed at providing the most complete edition of Aristotle's works in Latin. First printed in folio format in 11 volumes, the edition contained complex layout designs, parallel translations, and indexing. As highlighted by Charles Burnett, the edition is accompanied by an unusually detailed prefatory fascicle where we find more information on the editorial processes behind the edition. Introductions, behind the edition, introductions, the lives of both Aristotle and Averroes, errata corrige, and additional notes to the reader. This complex editorial project was marketed as follows, and I quote, "All the commentaries of Averroes of Cordoba on these works that have come down to us, and other books of his on logic, philosophy, and medicine, of which some too, having escaped the notice of the Latins, have recently been translated by Jacob Mantino. Others have been translated by the same scholar in a clearer and more faithful way than ever before, and the rest have been most diligently corrected in almost innumerable places from manuscripts and the best printed books of the most celebrated philosophers of this time of ours, each having been adorned with a large number of marginal notes." End of quote. The title page is a manifesto of the intention to provide the reader with completeness. The edition aimed at overcoming the lack of certain texts by providing new translations from Hebrew into Latin and by revising existing ones, but also aimed at overcoming the challenges of variants and mistakes in the existing textual transmission. The name of Averroes is as important almost as that of Aristotle, and particular importance is given, as we said, to those texts that survived in traditions other than the Latin one. That is, Hebrew translations of Arabic works that were not available in Latin, but also commentaries composed directly in Hebrew and here translated into Latin, such as those by the 14th century Provençal philosopher and biblical commentator Gersonides. Gersonides' name appears right on the title page, together with the name of the Jewish scholar, physician, and translator Jacob Mantino, credited with having translated and improved the sources coming from Hebrew. Mantino gained considerable fame in Italy among Christians and was appointed personal physician of Pope Paul III. Scholars are reconsidering more and more the importance attributed to Mantino over other translators from Hebrew into Latin, and there is certainly an element of marketing in this title page, but the editorial efforts in the Junta edition are truly impressive. The edition was then reprinted in 1562 and 1573-76 in octavo, a more portable format. The 1562 edition presents an introductory note to the reader that states explicitly that the intention is to provide a convenient format for the reader, student, to take the edition to school. Witness to the popularity of the edition and the need to have it in a portable format, in 1560, 2 years before the first reprint, we also find a pirate edition of the Junta, printed in Venice by Comendatrino in octavo. When it comes to the interpretation of Aristotle and Averroes in Latin, the Junta edition and its reprints were the state of the art and became widely adopted. It is a foundational publication that still shapes the study of Aristotle today. And here in your library you have, for example, a reprint of the 1562 edition in the reference section over there. But inasmuch as the Junta edition is an extraordinary editorial achievement, the text presented in it is a construction, as it did not exist as such before. But now let's stop for a moment and see how we got here. This search for completeness in the philosophical transmission of Aristotle and Averroes, the reconstruction of an ideal corpus that never existed as such in one language and one edition, and some of the very same translations that are presented in the Junta edition as new or improved, did not start with the Junta edition, but started more than 60 years earlier around Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and the translations of philosophical texts that he commissioned to the Jewish Averroes from Crete, Elagia del Medico. Pico's commissions were part of his wider interests for the Arabic and Hebrew tradition, which included also Kabbalah and mysticism, in which case he commissioned Latin translations of Kabbalistic texts to the Italian convert Flavius Mithridates. The collaboration between Del Medico and Pico's constant interest for Arabic and Hebrew sources belonged to the phase of Pico's composition of the 900 Conclusions, which he will publish on December 7, 1486. Almost there. Pico wanted to gather knowledge of the Arabic and Hebrew tradition in order to include names of authors and texts in his Conclusiones, which was also a project aimed at completeness and universal knowledge. The translations that Del Medico made for Pico, probably around 1484, 1486, before Pico's publication of the Conclusiones, were printed very early on, in 1488. In August, in Venice, we find the publication of Del Medico's translation from Hebrew into Latin of Averroes' short commentary on Aristotle's meteorology and part of his middle commentary. This very same translation was then reprinted in the Junta edition, but while in the 1488 edition you find Elijah's name mentioned in print, Del Medico's name was omitted in the Junta edition. In November 1488, the name of Del Medico appears in print again, this time in appendix to the questions on the Aristotle's physics by the French philosopher and Latin averroist John of Jandun. Among Del Medico's treatises printed here, there is also his super commentary on the long commentary on the physics. Interestingly, in the 1560 pirate edition of the Junta, the name of Del Medico reappears, this time next to the middle commentary on the metaphysics and the treatise and the spermate, both of doubtful attribution. Okay. Both in the intention of recovering and making available sources that had survived in Hebrew but not in Latin, and in the very same translations that we see here, we see how the seeds of the Junta editorial masterpiece were planted in the last quarter of the 15th century. Now, we've talked about printing of philosophy in Latin, and we've seen that already in 1488 we have Del Medico's translations in print, even with his own name. But what is happening in the printing of philosophy in Hebrew at the same time? Well, when we look at the printing of philosophy in Hebrew, there is a big difference between the middle of the 16th century, that is the time of the Junta Latin edition, and the end of the 15th century. For the printing of Averroes' works in Hebrew, we have to wait 1559, when in Riva di Trento, Jacob Marcaria printed Averroes' epitomes of the physics and of the organon. The printing of the epitome of the physics is also an interesting editorial case. Indeed, as shown recently by Yov Meirav, the version of the text that was printed by Marcaria was not that of the majority of the available manuscripts, but rather of the minority. In this case, the printed edition crystallized a text that is currently found in only 3 manuscripts against more than 35 carrying the other version. Hebrew printing started early in Italy, and from the end of the 1470s onwards, we find printed Bibles and biblical commentaries. However, in this first phase, there is not much philosophy being printed, with the exception of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Okay? Unlike what happens later in the 16th century, and unlike what happens in the Latin tradition, the translation of philosophy in Hebrew at the end of the 15th century happens almost exclusively in manuscripts. Okay? We'll see that when the Junta edition is published, the situation is already different. We have reprints of Maimonides' Guide, but we also have Sforno's Light of the Nations, and in Riva di Trento, in addition to Averroes' epitomes, we also have the publication of Gersonides' Words of the Lord. Okay? So, in the 15th century, when Del Medico works with Pico and he's looking for additional sources that he can translate and share with him, he's working with manuscripts. Okay? This is a letter composed by Del Medico while he is in Veneto, the region of Venice and Padua, where the university was the home of the Averroists, and addressed to Pico in Rome. The letter has been recently republished by Giovanni Licata and has been studied by him and Giovanna Murano, together with the manuscript that contains it. The same manuscript also contains Del Medico's super commentary on Averroes' long commentary on the physics, composed around 1485, and various other works and translations by Del Medico. From the letter, we understand that Del Medico was not simply sharing with Pico what he knew. He was also constantly adding to his knowledge and revising his own work, actively participating to the editing and publishing of his translations and works. In addition to the already mentioned printed editions of Del Medico's works, it's also worth mentioning that some of the manuscripts containing Del Medico's works that were commissioned by Pico were written by professional scribes that were working for Pico and were highly curated. In the letter, Del Medico provides Pico with a number of names from the Arabic Hebrew tradition, writing that these authors all wrote certain things on logic and philosophy. Among these names, I would like you to pay attention in particular to the name Ibn Jafar in Latin characters, and Abul Qasim ben Idris and Ibn Jafar in Hebrew. Del Medico is here bringing Pico's attention to names of Arabic authors that belong to the circle of Averroes, but that until today we barely know anything about. About Ibn Idris, we only know that he was the author of both logical treatises and treatises concerning natural philosophy, while until today the name Ibn Jafar here mentioned in this letter had not been identified. Later in the presentation, I will provide you with an identification of this otherwise mysterious author by looking at a specific collection of treatises preserved only in Hebrew. However, without looking at this specific collection of Hebrew manuscripts, the identification would be impossible, as it has been for scholars until today. So, Del Medico is working with Pico, suggests names of Arabic and Hebrew authors, and is actively engaging with the contemporary discussions about natural philosophy. It is worth mentioning that Hebrew manuscripts concerning natural philosophy, in particular commentaries on the physics, were among Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's first acquisitions of Hebrew material. From the inventories of the library, we know that he had the first 4 books of the long commentary on the physics in the Hebrew translation by Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, and portions of Book 2 of the Middle Commentary. He probably also had the collection known as Questions in Physics, and we'll go back to this collection in a few minutes. Pico is buying Hebrew manuscripts of natural philosophy, is commissioning translations from Hebrew into Latin, and Del Medico is working and researching with him and for him. But what was going on in the Hebrew context regarding natural philosophy? What is Del Medico looking at when he searches for additional Arabic Hebrew sources on natural philosophy to include in his work and share with Pico? Foundational scholarship by Ruth Glasner, Gad Freudenthal, Mauro Zonta, and many others has contributed enormously to our understanding of the reception of Aristotelian physics in the Hebrew context. Nonetheless, much work still needs to be done, especially on the 15th century. In order to portray the richness and the complexity that we encounter while working on natural philosophy in the Hebrew 15th century context, I have selected 3 case studies that deal with different kinds of material and show different ways in which natural philosophy was studied at the time. The first case study is a collection of treatises that has a very complex transmission history. I'm referring here to the manuscript of Vatican Urbinatus 41 to give you a glimpse of the composition of this collection. The collection contains 2 series of treatises that are known with separate titles. The first collection within the collection is that of the Questions in Physics, here numbered from 1 to 9, which consists of a number of treatises concerning physics and metaphysics that address questions such as the definition of time and eternity or the nature of human generation, for example. The treatises are attributed to Averroes and were originally written in Arabic, but the Arabic treatises are now almost completely lost and they survive as a collection only in their Hebrew version. Their second collection within the collection is the De Substantia Orbis, labeled here as DSO, which is a work by Averroes on the nature and composition of the heavens. This collection has a complex transmission history of its own, which would require the representation of the single treatises that compose it as separate items. But for today's presentation, I have simplified it and represented the whole collection as a single block. The De Substantia Orbis had been translated not only from Arabic into Hebrew, but also from Arabic into Latin by Marco Scotus at the beginning of the 13th century. The Latin so-called Old Translation was, however, incomplete, as it contained only 5 out of the 6 chapters that were preserved in Hebrew. The De Substantia Orbis was a popular text among both Jewish and Christian scholars, and we find numerous commentaries including Alvaro of Toledo, Jean of Jandan, Agostino Nifo, Pietro Pomponazzi for the Christian context, and Moses Narboni, Iuda Romano, and Elijah Del Medico for the Jewish context. The De Substantia Orbis had attracted the attention in the Hebrew version because of the missing part in the Latin context. The Hebrew version had attracted the attention of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who, as I mentioned, possessed a copy of this collection of treatises. In 1485, Elijah Del Medico had prepared a commentary on the text, both in Hebrew and Latin, where the Latin one was composed for Pico. In the commentary, Del Medico tells us about his translation of the chapter 6, the chapter missing in the Latin tradition, but unfortunately his translation is now lost. As we will see, it will be another 15th century translator, the Jewish physician and philosopher Abraham de Balmes, a few years afterwards, to translate this missing chapter from Hebrew into Latin, providing a translation that will make its way into the Junta edition. In the collection, you will also notice 3 additional treatises, not by Averroes, but by 2 Arabic authors active around the same time, Abul Qasim ibn Idris, with a treatise on prime matter and one of the first forms, and another treatise on prime matter, this time by Abu Jafar ben Sabah, which at this point might already ring a bell. What you find in yellow here, and also when you see the stripes in this scheme, represents the presence of the commentary by the 14th century Jewish philosopher Moses Narboni that accompanied the treatises in this collection. Moses Narboni is a widely understudied figure that played a fundamental role in the transmission of philosophy in the Jewish context. Born in Perpignan and active both in Provence and Spain in the 14th century, Narboni had at his disposal an incredible corpus of translations from Arabic into Hebrew and wrote commentaries on a great number of Averroes' works. his commentary on Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed is more well known, but there's still plenty to do regarding his commentaries on Averroes. Narboni was a central figure in the reception of natural philosophy alongside Gersonides, but unlike Gersonides, he has never received sufficient attention from scholars. Now, when we look at the transmission history of this collection, you can see that the only excellent Arabic manuscript preserves, which is the Escorial manuscript over there, preserves only treatises 7 and 6. And you can see how messy the transmission of this collection is. There is not even one manuscript that contains all the parts of the collection from introduction to colophon. If you pay attention to the yellow boxes and the striped boxes that represent Narboni's commentary, you will notice that the commentary is an integral part of the transmission of this collection. But Narboni did not only add his commentary to the treatises, he had an editorial plan behind the arrangement of the collection. And his editorial plan becomes clear only when we put together the various pieces preserved in different manuscripts. By looking at his introduction, the colophon, and the introductory remarks added at the beginning of the 7th question, we learn the following. First, we learn that Narboni envisioned the collection as one single collection, including the 9 treatises that I mentioned as the questions in physics, including the De Substantia Orbis, but also including the additional non-Averroan treatises by Ibn Idris and Abu Jafar ben Sabak. We learn this from the introduction, where he explicitly says that he's including non-Averroan treatises, and from the colophon, where he states that by completing the De Substantia Orbis, he's completing the questions in physics. We also learn that his commentary on the collection is seen as a continuation of his commentary on the physics, in particular on books 7 and 8 of the physics, and is considered complementary to it. This is a very valuable piece of information. First, because it places the collection in the wider framework of the study of Aristotle's physics explicitly, but also because, unfortunately, as far as we know, Narboni's commentary on the physics is lost, and we would not have known about it otherwise. Now, in this scenario, you would think that Narboni's editorial project, his vision of these treatises as a single collection, or his commentary, were taken into consideration at some point. Unfortunately, this is not the case. As concerns modern editions, in the 80s and in the 90s, we see 2 separate publications. On the one hand, the questions in physics, only the 9 treatises attributed to Averroes without the non-Averroan treatises by Idris and Jafar, and on the other hand, the De Substantia Orbis. In both cases, Narboni's commentary was not included in the editions other than a few notes. The exclusion of Narboni's commentary is not only a modern initiative, it had already happened in the Renaissance. The collection was translated from Hebrew into Latin by the Jewish translator Abraham de Balmes for Cardinal Domenico Grimani, in a translation that de Balmes hoped would be printed. While the questions in physics were not printed, de Balmes' translation of chapter 6 of De Substantia Orbis that I mentioned before, the one that was missing in the Latin tradition, was later printed in the Junta edition. This is the same chapter that had been already probably translated by Del Medico for Pico, but that unfortunately is lost. So it's the Balmes one that enters the printed tradition. Now, you see the Balmes at the bottom, and you see that he translated only the treatises of the questions in physics attributed to Averroes, excluding Narboni's commentary and excluding the non-Averroan treatises, de facto providing in Latin a text that did not reflect how the text was transmitted in Hebrew. In the case of the Balmes Latin translation, as well as modern editions of this collection, editors seemed to be animated by the intention to reconstruct what they thought would have been Averroes' original series of treatises, and made very significant editorial choices based on this criterion. Well, you might think maybe they had a point. Maybe Narboni's commentary was not that relevant. Maybe no one looked at the non-Averroan treatises. Well, let's see if that's the case. And let's start from the non-Averroan treatises. We said that we have three non-Averroan treatises, Idris on prime matter, Abu Ja'far ben Sabak on prime matter also, and Idris on the first forms. Well, we know at least two people who have heard these names in the 15th century, and these are not minor figures. We're talking about Elijah del Medico and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. When Del Medico writes the list of the Arabic and Hebrew authors who have written about philosophy, he mentions both Idris and Ja'far, and he must have seen one of the manuscripts containing the non-Averroan treatises. Don't forget that Del Medico wrote a commentary on the Substantia Orbis, therefore he was working with this collection. Now, not only is it important to know that Del Medico thinks that it's worth mentioning these authors to Pico, and that Narboni himself explicitly includes them in the collection, but another good reason not to overlook them is that the non-Averroan treatises per se give us precious information on Arabic philosophy around Averroes, which would otherwise be lost. Now, to answer the second question, whether or not Narboni's commentary can be overlooked, or whether it was overlooked by 15th century intellectuals, I'll proceed to the second case study. And this case study is based on a manuscript that is very dear to me, as it was the center of my PhD dissertation a few years ago, and it's the personal notebook of the Italian Jewish philosopher and Kabbalist Yochanan Alemanno, preserved at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Yochanan Alemanno was active in Florence and northern Italy around the same time of Del Medico, and a bit later. He was a student of the rabbi and Hebrew scholastic Yehuda Messer Leon, who was also an important political figure at the time, and Alemanno was one of the few Jewish students to receive a doctorate at this time. He got his doctorate from the University of Padua in 1470. Alemanno was very well connected, both with the Jewish and Christian most important cultural circles at the time, including contacts with Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, to whom he dedicated his commentary on the Song of Songs. His notebook contains a great variety of philosophical and Kabbalistic sources that embody the ideal library of a 15th century Jewish scholar. Within the notebook, there is a section dedicated to natural philosophy, where Alemanno copies two of the questions in physics, namely the question number 6 on generation and the question number 5 on time and eternity. Between the two questions, Alemanno copies a selection of passages from Gersonides' Words of the Lord, in particular from Book 5, Part 3, which is dedicated to the issues of the agent responsible for generation in the sublunar world and its relationship with the celestial real. The three texts together form a coherent unit of the notebook, which is also the only section with an explicit section heading, meaning that it reflects a moment in his studies where he was working on these texts at once. In both questions in physics, Alemanno copies the full text attributed to Averroes and also the full text of Narboni's commentary. Both Narboni and Gersonides combined become here the filters in Alemanno's interpretation of Averroes, and in some cases are more important than Averroes himself. This becomes all the more evident when we look at the use that Alemanno makes of the De Substantia Orbis in another section of the notebook. Alemanno here copies a section of the De Substantia Orbis in the first 3 lines, as you can see here. The circle in red marks the end of the quotation from Averroes, so it's 2.5 lines, okay? Marked in blue, the beginning of Narboni's commentary, which continues in the rest of the page, and on the following page, where a second hand intervenes to complete the text. So you can see the proportion here. There's 2.5 lines of Averroes, and the rest is Narboni. This section of the De Substantia Orbis contains a reference to the second book of the De Cielo, and the question at stake here concerns the composition of celestial bodies and the causes for celestial motion. Narboni's commentary delves into the composition of celestial bodies and their influence on the terrestrial region, in particular as concerns the transmission of heat. In his commentary, Narboni makes use of a number of additional sources, including Abraham Ibn Ezra's Book of Reasons, Ibn Ezra's commentary on Ptolemy's Centiloquium, and Al-Farabi's second treatise on the validity of astrological judgments. Narboni's commentary is evidently important for Alemanno, for the understanding of the text, and provides him with additional references that belong to the Arabic and Hebrew philosophical tradition. Not only is Alemanno not excluding Narboni, he's using the commentary and is through the filter of Narboni and by combining Narboni's commentaries with Gersonides that he's studying natural philosophy. And he's studying natural philosophy through the same commentaries that has shaped the study of natural philosophy in the 14th century and which heavily relied on the Arabic Hebrew philosophical tradition. If you take out Narboni here, you take out an essential part of Alemanno's understanding of Averroes. Editorial operations such as that of the Balmes in the Latin translation, which as we saw excluded both Narboni's commentary and the non-Averroan treatises, caused at least two things. One is the creation of a text that was not transmitted as such beforehand, and the second is the split between the reception of a certain text in different cultural contexts. What we have seen in the case of the transmission of the collection of the questions in physics and the De Substantia Orbis in Hebrew with Narboni's commentary, looking at it in comparison with what Alemanno does with this collection, we see in Alemanno an example of the Jewish reception, of the reception of this collection in the Jewish context. But if we look at the Latin operation made by the Balmes, by not translating Narboni into Latin, Narboni was left out of the Christian reading and interpretation of the text, creating two different streams of interpretation of the same collection because of an editorial choice, which would require the reader of the Latin version to go back to the Hebrew version in order to read the same text that was available to a Hebrew reader. Okay? So this is an example of how editorial practices aimed at reconstructing Averroes' ideal text while aiming at completeness ended up cutting out an essential component of the transmission of a text, or in this case, a collection, or multiple collections of texts. Okay. Until now, we have looked at case studies that concern the movement from Arabic into Hebrew first and then Latin. But the study of natural philosophy in the 15th century Jewish context also included a new wave of translations from Latin into Hebrew. As Ruth Glasner has shown in her research on Gersonides and on the genre of philosophical scientific commentaries, Averroes' commentaries translated from Arabic into Hebrew between the middle of the 12th century and the middle of the 14th century, and the number of super commentaries produced over time, had been the textbooks for Jewish students of philosophy. All three commentaries by Averroes on the physics were translated into Hebrew, and the middle commentary became the most studied over time. The long commentary on the physics, which was the longest of Ibn Rushd's long commentaries, was not copied often, and only one complete copy survives today. In the 14th century, we have a first wave of commentaries, including those by Gersonides and Moshe Narboni, which, as we saw earlier, tells us about his commentary on the physics in the introduction to the questions in physics. Narboni's commentary on the questions in physics and on the Substantia Orbis also belongs to this first phase of study of Averroes and Aristotle's physics. In the 15th century, right at the same time and among the same intellectual circles, where we find the study of Narboni, Gersonides, and this first wave of study of natural philosophy based on the translations made earlier from Arabic into Hebrew, we also see the emergence of a second wave of commentaries and translations, this time based on Latin scholastic sources. An absolute protagonist of the Hebrew scholasticism of the 15th century was Yehuda Messer Leon, which I mentioned earlier as the teacher of Yochanan Alemanno. Yehuda Messer Leon wrote his commentary on the physics in Mantua between 1473 and 1475, so around 10 years before the peak of the collaboration between Pico and Elijah del Medico around physics. And Messer Leon heavily relied on Latin scholastic sources. His commentary on the physics survives in 5 manuscripts, all incomplete. This Ambrosiana manuscript, for example, contains Book 1 of Iodamus Leon's commentary. As shown by Mauro Zonta, the commentary follows a precise structure where Hebrew and Latin commentaries are combined. Iodamus Leon includes passages attributed to Aristotle, taken from the Hebrew translation of the long commentary on the physics, together with passages from Averroes' middle commentary, also translated by Kalonymus, and passages from William of Morbecky's Latin translation of the physics, probably translated from Latin into Hebrew by Messer Leon himself, and introduced explicitly as the Christian interpretation of the text, here marked as anotzrit in the manuscript. The commentary also includes a super commentary on the long commentary, explanations or exposiciones labeled as shiurim, and questions patterned after scholastic questiones labeled drushim. The structure recalls that of Paul of Venice's exposition on the 8 books of the physics, where the physics is compared with Averroes' long commentary. Scholastic sources used by Messer Leon include Walter Burlei's Expositio, Paul of Venice's Summa Naturalium, Gaetano d'Etienne Recollectania, which these sources are, however, in the background, but they are not explicitly mentioned. The sources that are explicitly mentioned by Messer Leon are Grosseteste's Physics, probably known through Burley, Albert the Great's Physica, Thomas Aquinas' Sententia Libri Physicorum, Giles of Rome's Sententia Super Librum Physicorum, and William Occam's exposition in Libros Physicorum, in addition to John of the John Donne Questiones on the physics also. Okay. It is worth mentioning that Iodamus Leon was a rabbi and an important religious figure in 15th century Italy, and he introduced in Hebrew for the first time a number of scholastic and humanist sources. To give you an example of his interest for Latin sources beyond natural philosophy, I'll just mention that he translated into Hebrew Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria and the Rhetorica de Regnum, and these translations were printed in his Manual of Rhetoric, that is known as the first Hebrew book printed while the author is alive, the Sefer Nofetzufim, the book of the Honeycomb's Flow. Messer Leon was a prominent figure. He had been conferred the power to confer doctorates, and he was the one who conferred the doctorate to Johanna Nalmanno, which is a very astonishing thing if you're thinking about 1470 in Italy, and had a circle of students around him. The ferment around the Latin sources and overall the study of natural philosophy emerges from a number of manuscripts containing study materials, ascribable either to Iodamus Leon himself or to his circle, or to the wave, this new wave of interest for Latin scholasticism that he initiated. And I'll show you here some examples. So this is manuscript Paris 994, is an example of a summary of the physics, which is structured as a book of conclusions, Toledot, and recalls scholastic logic. The text contains passages very close to Walter Burlei's Expositio on the 8 books of physics. So you see the use of scholastic sources, the imitation of scholastic terminology and method of argumentation, both in logic and natural philosophy. Manuscript Plutio 126 is another example of the process of study, repurposing, and digestion of the scholastic sources and sources around the study of the physics, and deals in particular with books 1 and 2. It has been considered as sort of a super commentary on the manuscript that we've seen before, that reflects the process of absorption of Latin scholastic sources among students of Messer Leon or similar circles. Another example of study material around the physics is this Gunsberg manuscript, which provides a series of very brief sentences, also meant to summarize the content of the physics for each book. Okay, so you got each book and each chapter summarized in these very short sentences. Now, these manuscripts, as far as we know today, these manuscripts are all unique. They're not copies one of the other. They're all somehow related, and they do reflect the activity of a circle of students and scholars, but they are different from one another. And what they show us is that from the 1470s onwards, there is a great interest for the physics and a lot of activity around reading and integrating Latin scholastic sources into the main curriculum, which had traditionally been based on the Arabic Hebrew tradition. We see that the ferment around natural philosophy in the Jewish context involves various sources. On the one hand, we have the study of the so-called the first wave of commentaries based on the consolidated Arabic Hebrew tradition and on the works of Gersonides and Narboni that we've seen in Alemanno's notebook, for example. And on the other, and this persistence of the Arabic Hebrew tradition, which included sources that were not available in Latin, this is what Pico was looking for. This is what Pico was interested in and where his Jewish collaborators were drawing from. Okay? But on the other hand, at the same time, we have the Jewish circle around Messer Leon, where the ferment was based on Latin scholastic sources already in the 70s. And this shows us another side of the Hebrew-Latin, Latin-Hebrew exchanges. Now, it's worth mentioning and reminding that the protagonists involved in these exchanges are all contemporaries and somehow connected to one another. So Johanna Alemanno studied with Messer Leon. Both Alemanno and Del Medico worked with Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And in any case, if you had a doubt, everyone had been to Padua at some point. So looking at these case studies has allowed us to focus on the macro level of the manuscript transmission of natural philosophy and observe its richness and variety in a way that would not be possible were we to look only at printed editions. When we look at the relationship between manuscript and print and early print, we have to keep in mind that when the texts went from Hebrew to Latin, they were already conditioned. And we also have to keep an open perspective that includes multiple and stratified exchanges between different traditions. In our case, the Arabic, the Hebrew, and the Latin traditions. And only this open perspective will allow us to gain a full understanding of the composition and transmission of a text. Now, if we read again the title page of the Junta edition, where many of these early translations converged, we can now reevaluate some of its claims of completeness. We now know that many texts remained out of reach for the Latin-only readers. We know that Mantino's translations were the continuation of an earlier translation project that had started in the 15th century with Del Medico and the Balmes. And these translations were far from being complete. Overall, the edition is an artificial construction that had not much to do with how the texts were studied and transmitted before, neither in Latin nor in Hebrew. Once we are aware of how much has been marginalized by editorial choices, we can work towards bringing it back to light. And what I hope to have showed you today are a few examples of the treasures that we find once we start looking at manuscripts. From the forgotten Arabic thinkers Abu al-Qasim ibn Idris and Ibn Jafar to Moses Narboni as a key figure in the reception of the complex collection that includes the questions in physics and the De Substantia Orbis, to the study materials that give us an unprecedented insight into the convergence of the Arabic Hebrew medieval philosophical tradition and the new wave of interest for Latin scholasticism in 15th century Italy. Thank you.